Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath, and I am not in my office today. I'm actually at the Verizon headquarters in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, here to speak at the IAC conference over the next couple of days. And celebrate my birthday tomorrow. But I'm excited to bring you a new episode, and April has been my theme around environmental aspects of what we're doing in food and beverage and how we can be more sustainable, how we can help our attendees be more sustainable in what we're doing. And Googling, I found this guy sitting next to me. His name is Rob Vandenabeele, and we are going to talk about brewing a better world. He is a curious scientist and founder of ecofriendlybeer.com, which provides insights on how the brewing industry and its consumers can be environmentally mindful of Earth, the only planet that we know of that has craft beer. He is also a field manager for the EPA Pollution Prevention Grant that works with craft brewers. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Hi, thanks for having me. Exciting to be here with Earth Day just around the corner.
Right, exactly. And I'm really interested. I used to be a beer drinker. I'm putting that out there. I'm no longer a beer drinker because I'm allergic to yeast. But I'm really interested in. I think I drank too much Natural Light when I was in college. That's my joke about it. But I'm really interested in finding out how breweries are and can be more eco-friendly. So my first question is, tell us what is ecofriendlybeer.com and what got you started?
Yeah, sure. It's a slightly longish answer, so I'll do my best to keep it brief, but I think it's helpful to give a full sort of journey as to where I got to where I am now. So
Yeah.
20 or so years ago, started to really get into the craft beer scene. At the time, there was a lot of just brew pubs, mostly where you could go, and they were actually brewing their own beer on premise, which was really neat. That was a novel concept at that point. Fast forward a few years, and beer started to catch on a little bit more from a local perspective, more smaller breweries popping up in places. Beer festivals started to become this really big, fun, and enjoyable event. So I had a couple friends. We would frequent beer festivals. We were having a ton of fun. And then fast forward a few more years, and some really interesting licensing sort of came into play, where beverage producers, especially breweries, could now get specific licensing that would allow them to actually sell their beer on premise for on-site consumption. Prior to that, breweries really couldn't welcome guests to their places. They were just manufacturers.
Okay.
Some of the bigger ones tried to take advantage of tourism by allowing, a tour, and they would give away some free samples. But this changed the game altogether, allowing a small business to actually become, in essence, a beer producer and, I guess, a beer bar in some sense, although they call them rooms. This really expanded the industry. It went from a few thousand breweries to today, I think we're up to almost 9,000. The vast majority
Wow.
the vast majority of which, though, are tiny in comparison to someone like Sam Adams, for example, which out here is one of they're the first or second biggest brewery in the country. So my friend and I started to realize this culture was catching on. We were having a blast visiting these breweries and things. We took on a challenge to see if we could get to every single brewery in Massachusetts within a year, which at the time there were only 50. I mean, it seemed like a lot then. So we traveled all over, met some really fun, neat people, started some social media accounts, and eventually created a website because we just felt like it was too good to keep this all to ourselves. So from there, we had some really good relationships forged. And I then went back to school, to the Harvard Extension School, to get a graduate certificate in sustainability. And I can only describe it as a sort of an environmental epiphany, where I was partly frightened by everything I learned and partly inspired to
Mm-hmm.
say, what am I going to do now? I need to become, I guess, in essence, an activist of some sort to really start sharing this sort of awakening. And I had this built-in audience and these relationships within the craft brewing industry. So I started a new venture called Eco-Friendly Beer, and basically
Uh-huh.
trying to do the same thing. So it's a website, it's a social media presence, and the focus is more, instead of just being I guess, a beer cheerleader or a sharer of beer information, the idea is
Mm-hmm.
to help the industry and its consumers think about how can we be more conscious and environmentally conscious about the way we produce and consume beer. It's been really
Okay.
fun, and that's what led to eventually to my role with the EPA pollution prevention grant, working with beverage producers, mostly breweries, on how they can adopt environmentally conscious practices and be a little bit more thoughtful in that space. So it's been a really fun, enjoyable journey, and um,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's really cool. I mean, and I like the fact that you said you were scared and you were inspired by the things that you learned in that class from Harvard. But so talk about what are the, I'm going to say, the bad things that the industry does or that we don't know about that are not environmentally friendly in the first place. And then how are people moving away from those practices?
yeah. So just to keep it, I guess, bigger and briefer and more of an overview. Because like any industry, man, you could get into the weeds pretty quickly. But brewing is a material intensive industry, right? There's
Okay.
huge amounts of raw ingredients required to brew beer, between especially the malted barley and the other grains that might be used. And then you've got the hops as well, and then the
Okay.
yeast. So there's a lot of material that's required to do that, including water, which people don't think of all the time. It's more of a resource, I suppose, as a material, but a lot of water is
Right.
required to brew beer too. It's also very energy intensive. Again, I think if you don't work at a brewery, you don't understand how much heating and cooling has to go on.
Oh,
And once
wow.
the
Okay.
finished product is ready, it's got to stay cold literally 24 hours a day. If you're selling
Mhm.
it on premise, it might be kept warm if you sell it in distribution, but even lots of those places have obviously refrigerants for all of their beers that they sell, or at least some. And then
Right.
it's also unfortunately waste intensive. Again, there's huge amounts of I mean, we're taking just the liquid, right? That's what you're ending up.
Right.
All of those grains and all of that hop residue, the yeast, all of that stuff ends up as a waste stream. Everything that you receive at a brewery, unfortunately, and this is true of most industries these days, is
Uh-huh.
typically packaged in something. And often, if it's being
Mhm.
delivered on a pallet, it's packaged in a whole bunch of extra stretch wrap plastic around it.
Right.
So
Mhm.
breweries have relatively full dumpsters at the end of a brew day. And so there's a lot going on there that is just part of what it is to brew a beer. Um, Lots can be done in terms of efficiency, and
Right.
that's, I think, where the sort of low hanging fruit comes, because being more efficient doesn't always require any significant investment or money. It often just requires attention to detail and planning and having really
Mhm.
good, standard operations of procedure, and being thoughtful about how you want to purchase things, and when you get bigger, this is the sad part of being a small business, again, in most industries. When you get bigger, you have the economies of scale, which don't just
Yeah.
impact you with a benefit for like finance, but it often has an environmental benefit too. I'll give you a quick example. A
Okay.
large brewery has the opportunity, for example, to install a grain silo on its location, and so now
Okay.
we receive huge, like, 50,000 pounds worth of grain in one delivery, as opposed to, let's say, I don't know, that would probably be more like 10 or 20 deliveries for a smaller brewery over the course of every week or two, because they don't have a place to store all that grain. And that
That
grain
makes sense.
that comes that way is going to go straight into the silo, no packaging on that grain. Whereas the smaller breweries,
Mhm.
everything's packaged in a 50-pound bag. And the bag is, unfortunately, as everything is these days, a plastic package.
Plastic bag.
And so not really recyclable. Plastic film is very, very difficult to recycle, and not economic. So that's part of what fills up their dumpsters. So I guess efficiencies, economies of scale are really big things to think about. And then there are other smaller things, but every business model is kind of unique and different. So it can really vary.
That and it just reminds me, on my walk yesterday morning, I walked by somebody's driveway and they had like 50 bags of mulch in their driveway to put around, versus going down the street to the guy and having them dump the mulch into your driveway and having it, same kind of philosophy on that.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a really good point. Getting a truckload of mulch or a couple yards of mulch delivered by a truck that dumps it into your yard
Right.
is going to be better than going down to the garden store and buying 25 bags of it. But again, it's tricky because it does sometimes
Right.
depend. You have a driveway that they can dump it into, and can you?
Right. And or the back to lift it up and move it to the back of the house. Right. Yeah. To the backyard.
Yeah.
That's that. Okay, that's really interesting, because when we think about going to a local craft, all right, something just got in my eye. A local craft brewery, we don't think about all of that stuff behind the scenes. We just, hey, here's the pint that we're going to drink, right? Or the
Right.
growler. Oh, I pulled out a word since I don't drink, and and I mean, and when I was drinking, I said earlier, was Natty Light and Bud Light, and that was my drink of choice. And so, and it's been a little bit more than 20 years since you started this endeavor, and I started doing what I'm doing. So it's really changed a lot. How have you seen some of I know you've worked with some of the smaller brewers to look at this, and have you seen some success in what they're doing, and what are some of those low hanging fruits that they were able to do and see good results?
Yeah, and again, it is sometimes tricky because it really does depend on the brewery's business model. And as we both know, small businesses have such a wide range of business models. One of the big advantages or pluses of being a small brewery from an economic and an environmental perspective both is that having this ability to sell the vast majority of your product on premise is really, really beneficial. So a little secret about the beer industry that your average consumer doesn't know, but the packaged beer that they buy, especially cans at a beer store, let's say, or a grocery store that sells beer, has very limited profit margin for the brewery that actually brewed it. First off, they've
Oh.
got to invest in the equipment necessary to can all of that beer. They've got to pay materials that requires, which are the cans and the labels and the boxes that they have to go in. And then they've got to stretch wrap it and put it on a truck and send it to, one of these accounts that's going to sell it. And the company that takes the beer from them to the other account in many states, including Massachusetts, where I am, takes roughly 30% of the profit margin at
Wow.
the top just to do that and to market the beer to some extent for them. So when you get big enough, that's fine. You can sell
Right.
to hundreds, maybe even thousands of accounts throughout the state or the region. But for the smaller brewers, they need to sell it on premise, which is great because they make way more money that way. Not only do they get the 30% not deducted, but they're not paying for all of the materials or even the equipment to can it all and the labor that's required there. And on top of that, they can charge basically the same price that a beer bar would charge for their beer on premise because they're getting the same experience and opportunity. So nothing is more profitable for a brewery than selling a pint of beer in its own tap room. And again, from an
Right.
environmental perspective, everything we talked about is a benefit. And the other two big benefits are that when you're selling beer on premise on draft, it's going to go into a reusable keg. And reusable kegs, can be used for, a decade if they're taken care
Right.
of. And they're typically served in reusable glassware. So there's no disposableness that you have to worry about or deal with. Um, so really big environmental pluses there, and again, really big economic pluses there. So one of the things the small breweries I think are doing really well is just that, trying to
Okay.
sell as much beer out of their own place as they can to people who come and frequent and enjoy their taproom space. So having a really attractive tap room with some fun things going on is pretty important and helpful.
Well, and my friend Suzanne and I were talking about this a couple of months ago too, and I'm glad you brought up the kegs because I was going to ask you that. Because I mean the weight of the beer bottles, and I'm going to tie this into meetings and events. I'm like, when you go to an event at a hotel or a convention center, you've got your bottled beer, your canned beer, and they've, like you said, shipped it in on different things, packaged. I'm sure it's plastic wrapped or whatever, but just the weight of the transportation of those beers and those bottles and those aluminum cans would be much better than it's a lot more expensive than that keg. And then that hotel could, I think a keg party is, there we go. A keg party is more excited than, a can of beer party, right? Um, if I
Yeah,
remember correctly from college, right? Yeah.
yeah. My assumption is that hopefully there are still keg parties at most colleges. I'm not sure if they're drinking craft or not. They might still be drinking Natty Light, like you were saying, but yeah, definitely better. Yeah, so that's another sort of issue is beer miles, right? Or food miles is this concept
Hmm.
in the food industry. Like, where is
Right.
your food coming from? Another really big and helpful thing that smaller breweries do is they hopefully illuminate people to the idea that, oh, this beer is coming from right there where
Right.
I can see the brewer actually putting in some hops or canning
Right.
or whatever they're doing. So it really does encourage the idea of consuming local products, and so there's a definite, emissions benefit there if you're not distributing your beer all over the place, or if you're not really distributing very much of it at all. Because
Right.
if you've got a really good, busy, vibrant tap room, a person can make a reasonably good living just selling
Right.
all or most of their beer straight out of their tap room.
Well, and it reminds me now, the Pittsburgh Convention Center, I forgot the full official name of it. They actually grow hops on the roof, and they found a local brewer to take their hops and brew their own beer so that they serve in the convention center. It's not 100% all year long because they don't grow that much, but
Right.
they they at least have it to serve at their own events and saying, "Hey, we brewed this or we made this." I think
Yeah,
that's
and
really
again,
cool.
I think ideas like that, while they don't scale particularly well, they do again uh, get the consumer to think a little bit more about the benefits of
Right.
locally produced
Hmm.
things that we're going to consume.
Right. And I just like the idea too, just going back to those small breweries. I'm like, you've got 50 of them, well, at least the time when you did that, in the state of Massachusetts. If those hotels and convention centers can bring the kegs in, and serve it that way versus serving the beer of that, so you can bring that experience to that venue versus trekking them out to that experience as well. Um, there's when I was looking you up and researching you, the concept of craft for climate. Can you talk about what that is and how you're mobilizing breweries towards environmental responsibility?
Yeah, so Craft for Climate is a separate entity from myself. It's
Okay.
run by Alex Parker, who I believe he works in the brewing industry himself, mostly in the communications side of things. And he, like a lot of people these days, was just really growing concerned about the climate. And he wanted to figure out a way again to connect with people and try to get people thinking about it and talking about it. So he created this idea of Craft for Climate. And the goal was to get people to talk about climate um, through or over beers. And
Hmm.
a few years back, he reached out to me because he had seen the success that we had had here in Massachusetts with launching a can carrier take back program. And I can talk a little
Yep.
bit about what
Yep.
that is.
I want to know about that too. Yeah.
Um, so I had launched something here in Massachusetts, and then in Vermont, somebody had also seen the Massachusetts launch, and so I co-launched a successful program in Vermont. And Alex had seen these two and thought, well, that's a good idea. I could do that here. Let's run with it. And so I collaborated and worked with Alex for probably a couple of months to get it up and running in Chicago, and he's done a really great job of it. Had some really terrific sort of additional innovations that he put into it, and it's been quite successful. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but he's got, I don't know, well over 50 or 60 beer stores and breweries at this point that are collecting this plastic packaging that is otherwise not really recyclable,
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases getting it reused, which is the ultimate scenario. And when it's not reused or reusable, it's at least getting properly recycled through like a separate stream program. So a dirty little
Okay.
secret of recycling that a lot of people may or may not know actually is that a lot of the stuff we throw into our recycling bins doesn't actually get recycled, especially when it comes to small, intricate, weirdly shaped plastic items. And these can carriers fit into that category, even though it says 100% recyclable on the actual can carrier. That's a theory. It's not a reality, because the only way you can get recycled if it gets properly sorted. And we don't want to go too deeply into this, but
Right.
putting something in your bin is not the same as actually getting it to a facility that's going to melt it down and reuse it again.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of steps that have to happen in between that process that make plastic recycling very, very impractical. So
Wow.
anyways, he's had great success there doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure what else he's up to exactly right now, but people should check him out. It's Craft for Climate. It's actually, he's rebranded recently to the Green Beer Project is what he's calling it now. But if you go
Okay.
to forclimate.com, you can see what's happening. He's in Chicago, so if you're out there, definitely check him out, learn
Mm-hmm.
more about the can carrier program and whatever else he's up to. And yeah, Alex he's a good guy who cares about the environment and beer. So always happy to
Awesome.
collaborate with people like that.
And going back to your project that you initiated with the let's talk about how you're collecting those things. And it's not just necessarily the ones that we snip with our scissors to cut up the clear plastic ones that are around soda cans, right? It's the ones that more look like the lid to my cup,
Yeah,
right?
excellent
Yeah.
point. Let's back up a little bit, because
Okay.
there are probably some people here who aren't complete total beer and recycling nerds. So
Right.
so the old school 6-pack rings are made
Right.
from a flimsier sort of a plastic film, and those got this really well-deserved reputation for harming wildlife because of
Mm-hmm.
entanglement. And so many of the craft breweries and other beverage producers these days have moved away from those because of the, again, well-deserved sort of bad marketing that or bad affiliation that consumers would have with that product. By the way, with that product, there are recycling possibilities now. Again, don't throw it in your curbside bin. Either take it to a supermarket and drop it in the bin that collects all the plastic bags back that some of the supermarkets still use, or you can actually mail it back to the company that makes those rings primarily. And there's a program called the ringrecycleme.com, I think it is.
Okay.
Um, and they'll for free, they'll help you can print out a free mailing thing, and you can send back as many as you want to them, and they'll actually reuse them to make more rings. But most beverage
Wow.
producers have moved to a harder sort of a denser, harder plastic. It's an HDPE sort of plastic, and they're rigid carriers that snap on to the top of a 4-pack typically, or a 6-pack as well. And you kind of snap or pull them out of it. The company that makes them is called PackTech. There's some other companies that make them. Some people call it a can carrier. That's what I use. You might hear it referred
Okay.
to as a can holder, or even a can topper. So there's different terminology that people might use, but it's the cool plastic colored thing on the top of those 4-packs that you use a little finger to carry it out of the store with. And if it
Yep.
does have
Okay.
redeeming quality, it is that you can carry it out without any other additional bag or packaging. So those don't really get recycled if you put them in your single stream bin. When I realized this, I was not quite on my journey yet, but it really pissed me off because, like most people, I'm like, I care about the environment and I recycle. Like that was my big claim to fame back then, which I think was the case for most people 5 or 7 years ago. So then I started to think, well, why aren't they recyclable? And when I figured it out, I was kind of aggravated because, again, it says 100% recyclable right on the package itself. And so I started writing about that and thinking about that. And then it dawned on me that they did seem pretty reusable, and that a few small breweries I came to realize were actually reusing them when they could. And so we just
Okay.
sort of amplified this whole idea by saying, okay, let's get a whole big network of stores and breweries that will take them back with some simple sort of a little bin, right? Or a box
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, where people can drop them in when they come back to the store to buy more beer. And then from there, they just either get given back to different breweries, small breweries in particular that might use them because that's an expense. Packaging is an expense. Those things cost
Mm-hmm.
for a small brewery roughly 18 cents a piece. So they can add up after a little while.
Right. Yeah.
So it's great to get them reused whenever possible. And if they're not reused, then at least if they're all in a single stream of just that particular material, they can then sometimes find an end sort of buyer or end user to get that product actually melted back down and recycled or downcycled into something else. So we launched this
Okay.
in Massachusetts. We put some partners together, the Brewers Guild. We found a recycling company that would help us out. We found some breweries that were willing to do it.
Uh-huh.
Um, we made a map so that consumers could go onto the Google map and see,
Oh,
hey,
cool.
near me or a store near me that's taking them back. And there
Right.
was a lot of consumer awareness. And so people, as soon as they learned it, they were like, oh, wow, okay, that sucks that these aren't recyclable, but this is great. I can bring them
Mm-hmm.
back to Joe the brewery. So that was really fun. And we did the same thing in Vermont. And we took it even further. We called it the Reusiverse. We had this really cool infographic talking all about it. And we got a distributor involved there who was helping out with the moving of the can carriers and bringing them to certain breweries that would reuse them. And then again, Alex has replicated that very successfully in Chicago as well. And I'm sure it's happening in many other places
Right.
uh, in a variety of different ways now. Um, but it's not probably happening anywhere near enough still.
Right. And I just found the map for Massachusetts, at least. I'm gonna put that in the chat so people can look that up. I think that's really cool. I
Yeah.
mean, because then you can search out, those craft brewers that are doing things the right way, um,
Yeah, and you
in
can
a
help
in a
them.
manner that they can. Hmm.
Yeah, and you can
Yeah.
help them financially. I mean, there's one brewery in Massachusetts that um, we use the term rescued. Again, I guess it's a little bit of positive marketing there, right? So they
Right.
rescued and reused 25,000 of these can carriers in the past 2 years, like 25,000,
Wow.
and that equated to about $4,200 annually worth of packaging savings for them. So for a little
That's
bit of work,
huge.
yeah, just a little bit of work, they were able to do something that's really positive and
Right.
popular with consumers, and get some genuine marketing out of it and save some money as well. So that's an easy one that most breweries could do, and there are some other
Yeah.
things like that as well.
Now, and when my sister-in-law comes in town, we go to Brewery 99 in New Bern, North Carolina. And I know they've got the glass growler that you can take home. You can do that and take home and then just bring it back, right? And
Yeah,
then they clean it and give you a new one.
yeah. So refillable growlers are an
Mhm.
outstanding way to purchase your beer to go.
Mhm.
Sadly, the trend has largely moved away from the growlers in the last several
Oh,
years for some interesting reasons. Some I think have some validity, some I think don't. Um, there's the issue of having to get it back, and that can be challenging sometimes if you don't live near that brewery,
true.
and you're not going back there on a regular basis. You may not want
Mhm.
to buy a growler, because then what are you going to do with the growler later?
Right.
Some people claim that the freshness isn't as good, but I would challenge the average beer consumer to tell me the difference between a beer I poured for them out of a can versus one I poured for them out of
Right. Yeah.
a hotel, unless you're like a high level cicerone or something. Um, but anyways, yeah, if you have a brewery that still does refillable
Hmm.
growlers, and it's a brewery that's in your community, by all means, it's an awesome way, and it's fun too. It's this really
Yeah.
communal experience that's very different from
Hmm.
opening your own individual can. You open a big growler, which is either 64 ounces or maybe 32 ounces, and you share it with someone,
Right.
and it's a really neat experience. So I still love growlers. It's the only way I drink to go beer, but that does mean that unfortunately I don't have as many choices to
Right.
drink my beer when I'm at home as I used to. But it matters enough
Yeah.
to me that I'm willing to make that small sacrifice, and it'd be awesome if we could get more people thinking about that and making some additional small sacrifices, because yeah, we need them.
We need them. Exactly. Okay. So I want to go back to the grain conversation, and the
Mhm.
silos and stuff, but the less leftover grain. And I was
Yeah.
at the Natural Products Expo a couple years ago, and I sat in a session on regrain and what they're doing and taking, and like even one man has the leftover grain or the powder from when cherries are juiced, right? And he was trying to sell that powder. But then it reminds me as well, the grain part of the beer is that I think it was the Fairmont Hotel in Toronto
Hmm.
that was they were partnering with the local brewery and the local bakery, and the brewery was giving their leftover grain to the bakery, and the hotel was then buying that bread. Like, that's full circle right there. Can
Yeah, there.
you explain that and
Yeah,
share how that's being done?
absolutely. And there's a lot happening in this space. If there's an area or two that I'm most sort of excited about right now, it would definitely be this particular conversation around what the industry refers to it as spent grain, or
Yeah.
sometimes brewers spent grain, so
Mhm.
BSG. So first off, it's the largest solid waste material that any brewery has. So this is the byproduct of brewing. It's 85% of their solid waste comes from this grain.
Wow.
You need,
Wow.
let's say you're a very small brewery, maybe 3.5 barrel brewery, right? And so that
Uh-huh.
means each batch is like seven-ish kegs that you're going to get out of it.
Mhm.
It takes more than 200 pounds of grain, none of which ends up in the beer itself, right? Because when you brew beer, you're extracting the sugars out of the grain, but you're not using the grain itself. It doesn't dissolve or anything. You're left with all that grain at the end, and it's wet
Mhm.
and it's heavy, and so it's an issue for them because you have to deal with that. And if you don't have a good solid plan for dealing with it, you're going to pay, and nobody really wants to pay for that. So traditionally, it's been
Pay
going.
how? What do you mean pay how?
You got to pay somebody to haul it away.
Oh, okay. All right,
And if
gotcha.
you got a dumpster every 2 days that's full of like several hundred
Wet.
pounds of
Yeah.
wet, heavy stuff, the hauler is going to be like, dude, this is expensive. Like, we're going to raise your prices. Like, we don't. And in many states like mine, it's an organic waste ban that actually prevents any beverage producer, or any company for that matter, for sending that amount or that volume of organic waste to the landfill. Like, you're not even
Oh,
supposed to do
wow.
a landfill organic waste ban, they call it here in Massachusetts.
Okay.
So you're also risking getting caught and getting in trouble. So you got to have a solution for it. The traditional solution has mostly been to send it to animal agriculture as feed. And while that
Mhm.
is definitely better than just sending it into the waste stream, it's not an ideal or perfect scenario either. So what is? Well, using it for further human consumption. And there's some really cool things happening. And as you said, one of them is that this material, the spent grain, has real nutritional value. So it's high in
Okay.
protein, it's high in fiber, and it's lower in sugar because much of the sugar, not all, but much of it's been extracted to make the liquid that gets boiled and then fermented into beer. So
Right.
it's a really good product in and of itself that can be used in baking. You wouldn't use just straight spent grain to bake something. You would supplement it along with some other types of flours or other grains or whatever. But
Okay.
it's really neat, and interesting, flavorful sort of product that some bakeries and bread makers and dog treat makers, granola
Oh,
makers, snack food makers. I've seen probably at least 6 different renditions of a product or a company, basically using these spent grains to create some sort of a really cool, interesting product. Um, and even more interesting than that, actually, is that there's a couple of really cool innovations happening now too. One of which is that you can take that material and you can dry it and then make it into, I think you had actually mentioned this, into a more of a like a powder or a flour. And you can then
okay.
sell that powder or flour as a very, very versatile ingredient that almost any food maker who has flour in their product could use as a nutritionally beneficial supplement. So
Interesting.
AB InBev, which is the largest beer company in the world, they're international now. They own Budweiser, and the St. Louis Budweiser brewery actually has a new offshoot known as Evergrain, and Evergrain is doing just this. They're using all the spent grain from the beer that's brewed in that particular brewery, and they're creating these products with it and trying to get them out into the food industry. So it's really neat.
Wow, that's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
One other one that's also equally amazing and interesting is there's a startup here actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm from, and it's known as Zenso, Zenso. And this is a longtime brewer in the industry. And he was worked in wineries for a while as well, and in biotech. And he had always been sort of agitated by the fact of this huge stream of organic waste and not having any great solutions for it. He created this new type of enzyme and yeast
Okay.
strain, and they're sort of a proprietary combination of those two into a process where he can now brew a beer, take that spent grain, use that actual spent grain to rebrew a second alcoholic product. For example, a hard seltzer or maybe
Oh,
a
wow.
ready-to-drink cocktail without having to buy another, like I said, for a small brewery of 3.5 barrels, another 200 plus pounds of grain. He's getting
Right.
literally 2 batches out of the one purchase of that grain. And that's really amazing because not only is it twice as efficient, but it's economically quite beneficial.
Right.
And
Yeah.
he's got this product line. So if you're ever in Massachusetts, take a look for Zenso. It's a ready. There's 3 or 4 ready to drink cocktails as well as a hard seltzer, different flavors. But he's also going to be licensing the technology so that any brewery anywhere, in theory, could use this sort of proprietary enzyme and yeast mixture and do this right there at their own facility, which would be pretty awesome, especially for smaller breweries to really help with an additional revenue stream. As you were saying earlier, you don't drink beer much these days.
Right.
Craft beer industry is really interesting these days. There's been so much change, and a number of people are not drinking quite as much craft beer maybe as they used to.
Hmm.
They are interested in ready to drink cocktails and hard seltzers and ciders and non-alc beers and all kinds of things. So being able to diversify your product stream, I think,
Totally. Yeah.
in and of itself is valuable. But when you can do it for practically free in your own facility, I mean, that's a
Right.
potential
Yeah.
change. So any
Yeah.
small
And
brewery that's listening in, think about reaching out to Zenso.
yeah. And I just put their Zenso Labs website address in the chat. And not on, I'll put it on LinkedIn in a bit. It goes to all the other links instead. But that's really interesting because then And when you were saying that, it reminds me too of like taking my leftover carrot shreds and celery butts and putting it in the freezer and then making my soup out of it, right? My
Absolutely.
vegetable broth. So doing
Yep.
that same kind of concept,
It's
but
it's
with the
exactly
spent
the
beer.
same idea, right? It's a product that doesn't seem like it has a value for what you're currently doing, but
Right,
it does have a value for some other purpose.
right, right. That's so cool. And then I got to figure out what to do with all the leaves after I cook them down to make my soup. But
Yeah,
that's a
so
whole
you
nother
still have that
conversation.
issue, but that's what composting is for, or
Right.
anaerobic digestion.
Mm-hmm.
Or in this case, you can, as a brewery, you could use your product, your grains, your twice, and now you can still send that to animal agriculture if that's your ultimate end of
That's true.
end goal line.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. Now, is anybody doing anything as related to renewable energy in the craft market?
Yeah, for sure. I would say this renewable energy isn't unique, or there's nothing special about it from the brewing industry perspective.
Okay.
But as a
Mm-hmm.
small business, if you haven't looked seriously at how you can source renewable energy, um, that's your first assignment, honestly, when
Okay.
you get off of this podcast here, is to go and reach out to either your local government website that might have this kind of information, or maybe a local energy nonprofit that would have
Mm-hmm.
it. And you can obviously you can put a solar array on your roof if you have the
Right.
right conditions for that, and that has been made very, very attractive these days. The incentives are pretty amazing. In some cases, depending on where you are, you can get up to 50% of that literally subsidized and paid for through incentives. And then there's additional tax breaks that come along with that every year that you own the array. And on top of that, obviously, you're now generating your own energy. And so there's some real benefit there. You're going to cut down or eliminate your electricity bill. And
Right.
when you do the ROI on solar arrays, it's far more appealing than I think maybe most people might realize, especially from just 3 to 5 years ago. So definitely
Right.
that's one possibility or option. There's other things in that space too, like if you have a big parking lot, like a solar canopy makes a ton of sense. Maybe even have
Mm-hmm.
some electric vehicle chargers as part of the solar
Chargers.
canopy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but even easier than that, and cheaper, like right from the outset, is to just see what renewable energy sourcing options you have as a small business. So there's
Okay.
a idea called community solar that's taking off in some parts of the country, where somebody else has a big space or a big rooftop. They create a solar array and they sell that
Mm-hmm.
energy to other consumers. You can typically get that for, again, very, very affordable, sometimes in some instances cheaper than what you're paying for your regular utility electricity. In some states, they have what's called electric aggregation, which means that your municipality
Uh-huh.
will have bargained specific rates to try and
Okay.
get a really good deal on sourcing renewable energy. And the
Mm-hmm.
consumer benefits from that because, again, you've got the economies of scale working in your favor there. And there are a few other ideas as well, but yeah, find somebody who knows what's going on with renewable energy and incentives in your area, and definitely look into that. There's in all likelihood some real benefits, not just for the environment, but again, something you can genuinely market, and something that has the potential to maybe right away, but if not, most likely in the long term, benefit you from a financial perspective too.
That's really cool. And depending, it depends on where you are, how big your city is, et cetera, on how that works. So the jurisdictions. But when you were talking about that, it also reminded me of my friend Dave in Atlanta, who this was years ago, wanted to collect the rainwater from his rooftop. So like had a silo and wanted to brew his beer doing that rainwater versus getting it from the tap, I guess, as for lack of a better thing. Are there any breweries that you know of that are doing that? And he was denied the opportunity to do that, saying he couldn't do it. So, but Is it a viable option?
Right now, I describe it as mostly more of a novelty right now, but there
Okay.
is definitely um, some innovation, I think, that is underway and in the works that is going to make recycled water, we'll just call it, because there are lots of
Okay.
different ways to do this. Um,
Hmm.
but recycling and reusing water is absolutely something that's going to happen more in the future and will probably be more economically viable as, again, we get policy to catch up with the times.
Right.
In
Hmm.
particular, if you start going out to the Midwest and the West, where water is a real concern and worry
Hmm.
at this point in history, a lot of people are really looking at it there. There's some really fun things, and you'll probably, if you haven't yet, you'll probably see some interesting headlines from time to time, a bit sensational. For example, many breweries have taken water from their own system and worked with a water filtration company to recycle it
Hmm.
and use it. And you'll see sometimes these crazy things like your urine has now become your beer or something ridiculous. But we recycle
Yeah.
water all the time, right? That's
Right.
what every
Hmm.
city does. Like it's like the water that comes down out of your tap or your toilet or wherever it goes, it gets treated and it
Hmm.
back out, and eventually we're reconsuming that. But we'll get much better and more efficient at that. And yeah, hopefully Dave will get to actually capture rainwater. He'll have to
Right.
figure out how to, if he wants to brew beer with it, he'll have to figure out how to get it properly treated and filtered.
Right.
But
Right.
I'd be surprised if he couldn't at least use it for some other purpose. There's a really cool
Right.
brewery that I visited this a couple summers ago. It's over in England actually, but they capture rainwater and they use it for their toilet flushing.
Oh,
So
wow.
that didn't really
Okay.
require any special permitting or anything because obviously
Right.
no one's consuming toilet water. It's just flushing everything. So, um,
Right.
yeah, if he hadn't thought about that, ask him if that would be kind of
I
interesting.
will. I will. Yeah, I need to send this in and say, "Hey, I brought you up." Okay, so we're oh my gosh, we're at 47 minutes. So I have two final questions for you. One, when how can consumers best find these companies as also, and the same kind of question tying that in, how can meeting planners and the hospitality industry tie into this eco-friendly beer model so that we can be better consumers to help save the planet?
Yeah, I'm glad we circled back to this question. We've addressed a fair
Mm,
amount of it already indirectly, but it's important to think about. So first off, uh, craft beverage is a pretty strongly consumer driven industry. In other words, what the consumer wants is largely what these small businesses kind of have to do, whether they want to or not. And I'll give you
okay.
a super brief but important example is the vast majority of breweries these days are brewing something known as a hazy IPA. And they're brewing and
Okay.
selling a lot of that because that's what the consumer has demanded. And that's a trend that just started 3 to 5 years ago, maybe, or maybe slightly more than that.
Okay.
So if a brewer doesn't really care for that particular style, doesn't really have a choice. People are coming in, they want that. And there's lots of other examples of that. Um, so on the negative side to that, unfortunately, though, is that consumers largely still want convenience,
Hmm.
and convenience is not good for the environment at all. So they want their beer on the run, they want it at events, they want it at places, and they want to drink it and get rid of it, and they don't want to worry about it. So it doesn't encourage what we talked about earlier, which is draft beer in reusable glassware. That would be the ideal. So
Okay.
if consumer really wants to be thoughtful, they should look for that and ask for that and demand that whenever they're off premise, like if they're not at a brewery, like and event planners, I think it can definitely be done, and it provides, in my personal opinion, and I think almost everybody else's, though maybe they don't recognize it quite as much, a much better drinking experience. When you're drinking something on draft, you see it poured right there. It's in a reusable glassware, which just is better to drink out of. You can see it, you can smell it,
Right.
anyways, that would be really big. So definitely try to drink draft beer whenever you can, and in refillable containers and reusable containers whenever possible, even though it may not seem as convenient. You just have to invest a little bit of time and effort and money into it, but I think it's worthwhile.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's probably more we could talk about, but that's kind of a big
Oh,
one.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I do think, even taking me back to my conversation with my friend Suzanne, is like, why not have kegs? I mean, it just makes sense if you've got a big party, instead of popping all of those bottles, and the fact that a lot of jurisdictions are not recycling glass these days.
Right.
So it makes more sense to do kegs.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not recycling anything particularly well. The national recycling rate for beverage cans, aluminum beverage cans, is 45%. It's lower for glass, even lower for plastic, and don't even get me started on compostable cups. It'll talk for 45 minutes about the sham of compostable cups for the most part. But yeah, we need to move away from that as much as we can. And again, the other big one I think would be, so venues, when you're a venue or an event, like find the local brewery or breweries or beverage producers and
Mhm.
get something from them. Don't don't just get something from one big conglomerate provider who probably has a product that's coming from a different state, or a product that's maybe owned by the AB InBev company. They own a lot of former craft breweries these days.
Mhm.
Uh, so figure out who's local and get something, if possible, directly from them. Again, better for
Right.
their profit margin. And I think you forge this better relationship, and you keep the money right there in the community. And we could go on.
Exactly.
Everybody knows
Yeah.
the buy local idea, but we need to actually commit to it a little bit more, I think.
Right. Exactly. Oh, I love that. Okay, so my final question, which is one I ask everybody, is what does safe, sustainable, and inclusive mean to you in your eco-friendly beer drinking world?
Ah,
Somebody just said, before you answer that, kegs with red Solo cups, and those aren't environmentally friendly. No, but if you could use a reusable red Solo cup, because they do have those other ones, or a glass cup, that would be better.
yeah, the keg is
Yeah.
ideal. Just get rid of the
Mhm.
red Solo cup.
Right.
And and yeah, just have like I've got a stainless steel cup I'm drinking from here.
Yep.
Or even just a clear plastic. If you have to have a disposable cup, at least make it be clear plastic, because that has a reasonable chance of potentially getting recycled. Anything colored is probably not going to.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so yeah, so safe. Oh man, that's an interesting one. So I don't think we're doing a ton from a safety perspective these days. If you want to go really existential, right, and say what's the ultimate sort of safety concern here? Well, having a livable planet. I mean, we
Mhm.
need to, again, really, I think, um, sort of come up with better thoughts, ideas, and commitments on what we can all do. It's not economically ideal right now, but we need policies to come into place that will help us make it more economically viable. Um, Again, the word sustainable is really a loaded word for me these days, because it largely means almost anything to whoever wants to use it. You'll hear a lot of stuff described as sustainable, but if you know
Right.
the actual true definition of what sustainable means, very few things are actually sustainable. It's something that we can use responsibly now to
Mhm.
fulfill our needs, and without diminishing the ability of future generations to be able to meet their needs. And what I would offer is that instead of needs, we're using sustainable in areas that are wants and not needs, right?
Good
And
point.
that
Yeah.
is a real concern, because that's where we're overdoing it. If we really need something, I get it, we have to use resources. If we just want some things, we're going to have to get over it, and come to the conclusion that with the number of people currently on the planet and the rate of consumption that we're in developed countries used to, isn't actually sustainable forever. We're currently using, I think it's something like 1.75 Earth's worth of resources over the course of a year, and we just can't do that forever. We're running a deficit, in other words.
Mhm. Right.
Um, So really need to think that. And in terms of inclusive, man, that's an interesting one too, right? I mean, we're doing better, but as a whole in the country, I mean, we can obviously make a lot more gains in terms of inclusivity. The beer industry is a really interesting one because it's been largely um, white males driving it, but there's
Mhm.
definitely been some really cool inclusivity components sort of making their way into the industry. If people aren't familiar with these two thoughts, one is there's a group called Pink Boots Society, and they're a national group with a lot of regional chapters. We have a pretty awesome regional chapter here in the Metro Boston area. And their idea is to bring in and support and acknowledge women and non-conforming gender people of all sorts who traditionally haven't really felt all that welcomed or safe maybe in the brewing industry, and they're doing some awesome
Mhm.
things. Another one is the National Black Brewers Association, which I think if I read it right recently, it was mind-boggling to me. There's like 1% maybe of the breweries in the country were actually owned by African Americans. And so they're making a concerted effort to obviously increase that number. And again, to support those types of business owners in their endeavors so that they can be successful.
Well, and then I want to add one to you. Last year, I interviewed two women who started the Women's Craft Fermentation Alliance.
Nice.
And so
And
they're pulling women in from all over the world, in that fermentation process there. And it was just such an interesting conversation
that's great.
about
Are
all the
they
women
based,
that are doing that. Yeah.
you know where they're
They're
based
in
out of?
US.
Okay.
US. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
I'll introduce you to them. They're very cool.
Yeah, it'd be
Really.
great.
I think they're actually in Northwest, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, this is so interesting, and I'm so glad that you're tangent and that you were scared and energized by your Harvard class, and that you are making the efforts to help breweries be more sustainable and all of us to be more sustainable. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if I could have one closing thought, it would be that
Yeah.
still scared, and uh, we need more people to be a little more scared, and we all need to be a little more inspired to really, again, take some sort of an activist role. It doesn't have to be that you're doing some of the crazy activist things that we might see out there making headlines. Can do those if you want to, but there's lots of all sorts of other smaller activist sort of things that people really need to be thinking about if we're going to get the attention of the people that are largely making all the policy decisions that drive our economic decisions. So
Awesome. Well, and I think my first step is the two events that I'm hosting in the next 2 months. I'm going to say we're going to serve beer out of kegs. So I'm going to make that request and see how far I get.
yeah, I'm happy to support in that. And I think what you'll need, just one bit of advice, find a brewery first that would be up
Okay.
for it. And because they will
Okay.
be able to they'll be able to tell you all, they'll be able to answer all the questions that the venue or the caterer or whoever will have to ask you.
Okay.
And the brewery can help you answer all those questions and do that. But find a good brewery partner.
Okay. I will do that. Thank you. All
Yeah.
right. Everybody, I'm so glad that you tuned in and thank you for listening to Rob and learning more about brewing a better world. Um, Monday, because we mentioned Earth Day. Monday is Earth Day, and actually, I'm going to be on the show. Have I think 2 episodes on Monday to talk about single-use plastics and what we in the meetings industry, can do to reduce single-use plastics besides buying kegs and serving beer out of kegs at our event. So until then, actually, somebody just wrote a comment in. Thank you, Tracy and Rob. I think that's my friend Nancy. So thank you, Nancy, for listening. Um, until then, stay safe, eat well, and go find a beer from a craft brewer. I'll talk to you later. Thanks,
Okay.
Rob.
Yeah. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.